Unifying principles underline, no pressure, evolution, computation, cognition, and AI. Evolution, computation, cognition, and AI. And how we can leverage them to design the next generation of thinking systems. So what are these principles that underlie evolution, computation, cognition, and AI? So I'm a genomicist. I've been working in genomics for many decades now. And I've been studying gene regulation. I've been studying sort of the basic principles through which genomes function, how genomes encode regulation. Because the analogy of the genome as a hard drive breaks down in the sense that the genome is a self-regulating hard drive. All of the commands, all of the operating system, all of these things are sort of encoded within the genome itself. And you could ask, how is the genome able to navigate the landscape of solutions to these complex problems? And what's really phenomenal here is that we encode it within the genome, which needs to replicate at every generation from a single cell, to then recreate the entire body plan of humans. Within that is in fact encoded the entire circuitry for our brains, which is then able to capture knowledge and represent knowledge and re-encode knowledge in yet another layer. So there are some fundamental similarities in evolved systems, such as the brain and such as the genome, that have a lot of similarities with what we have as AI right now. And it's perhaps not a coincidence that humans make the same types of mistakes that AI seems to make. For example, if you ask, a 10-year-old kid to draw a person, they'll probably draw the wrong number of fingers, or the fingers will look really awkward. And guess what? AI has the same type of trouble as well. If you sort of show a picture of, a dog or a muffin, I don't know if you've seen those, they often, get confused by humans and by AI alike. So it's kind of interesting that the same type of architecture that we evolved to deal with our physical world, and that we somehow, through this repeated improvement that evolutionary processes are all about, has kind of converged to the same type of inferences that AI has. So I think that, that poses a lot of questions. And sort of, as I think about, again, evolution, computation, cognition, and AI. So we talked about evolution. I didn't talk so much about the genome, about how it approximates the functions. So basically, there's an evolutionary landscape upon which you're, exploring the world. And then there's the actual encoding of what you've learned about that. And at the basis of that is tinkering. At the basis of that is not the circuits that we like to draw when we engineer systems that have like one big wire and a bunch of if statements and a bunch of asserts and stuff like that. Instead, what we have is these tiny little weights that control the expression of genes from hundreds of regulators binding together and thousands of signals converging. And it's not unlike the weights of our own artificial neural networks. And if you look at the way that the brain works, again, backpropagation is not exactly the brain, but it was modeled after what we thought the brain was doing. And a lot of the operations that we have now is not exactly what the brain does, but it is again modeled after the brain. And you could even say that the transformer architecture, this whole attention mechanism, the ability to reinforce edges that appear to be associating with similar objects or relevant objects, etc., is not unlike the same type of synaptic pruning that we have within our own neuronal networks, and this reinforcement. So I see a lot of common principles there. I see the principles of, instead of encoding something with if-then statements, encode something much more organically, much more dynamically, much more scattered in these in their weights. Another commonality is that of abstraction. So as you start thinking about computations, you start thinking about computer programs, or you start thinking about sort of what is the foundational principle behind programming and software engineering. That principle is the principle of abstraction. What is abstraction? Abstraction basically means that I have multiple layers of representations. And at the base layer, I have very simple commands. And I can encapsulate those in building blocks. that it will then use for the next layer, and the next layer, and the next layer. So there's a lot of power in doing that, and that's not unlike what even our genome does, in being able to sort of just black box some operations that are then building on previous machines. For example, if you look at a human as a system, we need to fight off an infection. There are specialized pathways and modules inside every one of our cells. The cells themselves are, units of computation, units of function. They function together as systems. Again, my kids are now learning about the immune system and the respiratory system and the bone system and all of these things. Basically, these are intertwined systems within your body. And if you have mutations in the DNA, you don't see any humans being born like inside out or like, I don't know, with 20 limbs or something like that. And even just, being born with multiple limbs, I mean, these are limbs. These are not just like weird cross-cutting like fingers sticking out from anywhere. So there's instructions in even the body plan formation of development that are convergent, that are sort of encapsulated in the way that individual pixels will not be altered in an image, but instead it will be objects. So if you start messing with the internal representations of a neural network, of a convolutional neural network, trying to understand an image and represent an image, that image is going to have weird complete shapes coming about rather than individual pixels messed up. And a lot of that has to do with compression. The fact that as we see objects, we're immediately compressing them down. And every now and then you'll see an image that's like damaged, but you're able to restore the damage and sort of observe the stuff behind, which is part of that lower dimensional representation of the world. And all of that, again, is based on the same principles of abstraction, of hierarchical representations, of modularity, which underlie, genomes, evolution, and all of these other things. Computation, cognition, and AI. So again, it's not just that our brain and AI appear to be similar, it's that there seems to be something much more fundamental about representing the physical world and representing concepts and images and even thoughts that sort of is easily approximated using this type of operation. And if you take one thing out of this presentation, it's going to be centered around that concept of representation learning, of being able to not think of modern day AI as simply a continuation of the neural networks that we had in the 60s, but to think about modern day AI as, yes, we have a fully connected network in the end, if you wish, to approximate some functions, but it's all about that first part of representation learning, okay? And I want to perhaps jump right into this slide here, where I'm basically talking about these three vectors. So on one hand, you have your data, and that's X. Then you have your labels, and that's Y. And a lot of the revolution in deep learning and in modern day AI happened by this picture. And this picture has two components. On one hand, you have the boring, fully connected neural network of the 60s. And that I agree with, it's still there. Perhaps no longer, but in that picture it's still there. But what's much more exciting about this picture is this Z vector, this Z dimensionality. What is that? This is something where the system is extracting representations from your image. It is not looking at individual pixels. It builds up from the pixels with filters, which we call convolutions, checking of, oh, is there a line here? And you scan that image for a line this way, and a line that way, and a line that way, and a line that way. And then you have a first layer that doesn't look at the pixels anymore, but it looks like the first layer of abstraction. And then on that layer of abstraction, you now say, okay, do I see two of these nearby? Oh, maybe that's a corner. And on that corner, you now see shapes and circles and eyes. And then you scan for eyes. These are filters on maybe the 10th layer. And this is not unlike what happens in your visual cortex. So basically your primary visual cortex is receiving an inverted image from your retina of the space around it that is basically pixels. But immediately after, you have all of these convolutions running operations that effectively extract features and representations from this. And some of those representations we have evolved for. In other words, there's a bunch of lines, in the world. Maybe we can hard code the concept of a line in our genome so that at the next generation, we can already recognize lines and we don't have to wait until our neural network learns them. But other concepts, such as language, for example, are not hard-coded, and instead they are learned at every generation. At every generation, you basically see your kids, sort of staring out, listening, they're sort of figuring out, they're training their edge detectors, they're training their, basic building blocks, upon which then all of their learning will happen. It will not happen at the level of pixels, it will happen at the level of representations. Is everybody with me here? Awesome. So that's what cognitive cartography is about. What we basically said is, hey, I want to look at the X and I want to look at the Y. Why? Because the Y is basically categories that we humans know about already. This is stuff that's like training data. And the power of machine learning today is that, frankly, we don't need human annotators anymore. Why? Because I can basically go into that image and hide a box and say what is in that box. And if the neural network is kind of, moderately not completely dumb, it will basically say, oh, I'll just follow the gradient of colors. And that's fine. With enough parameters, you will learn that images typically follow gradients of color and will be able to fill in the missing box. But eventually, if you start giving it more and more and more and more parameters, it will recognize that to get better at filling in that box, it better build an internal representation of the entire physical world. You better understand that boats have, sails on one side and water on the other side. That cars have like a steering wheel on one side and a fender on the other side, and so on and so forth. So this is not unlike the training of ChatGPT. So when you train these large language models, what are they doing? They're basically doing next word prediction. And many people dismiss ChatGPT as, it's just next word prediction, who cares, it's not intelligent. I'm like, yeah, but that's how they train you. That's not what it does. What it does is the emergent behavior, once it has figured out that the best way to get at next word prediction is to understand syntax and grammar and language and semantics and prose and style and the language of speech and every human language, and then concepts like liberty and justice and stuff like that. And that's how you edge out the extra 2-3% of performance. So with a sufficiently large number of parameters and this self-supervised learning architecture, you can basically get at representations of the world that are immensely complex. And what we have in our everyday life is cognitive systems. Every one of you was trained using a different subset of the English language. Many of us learned it as our second language, some of us as our third language. And we have relearned how to speak English to the point that we understand each other and that we understand the difference between the concept of, liberty and freedom. And if you were to use them in a sentence, you would not use them interchangeably because you've understood from the context in which these words appear, their semantic similarity and their subtle differences. My kids don't understand this, but as they grow older, they build sophistication, not only because their exposure to language is longer, but because their brain, their hardware actually continues to grow, continues to get bigger, like the connections themselves. The underlying hardware continues to evolve. So concepts that when they were babies were blended into one are now starting to come apart. And this is, again, in many ways, the way that the last generations of training will basically partition the human language. And even though every one of us has been trained on a tiny subset and a different subset of the English language, we're all able to communicate. What does that say about the English language? It's actually kind of simple. Understanding how to speak human language is actually very simple. there's a lot of repeating patterns, and there's a very small number of patterns. The fact that machines speak English is not surprising. But I've built my career around a language that we humans don't speak. That is not a language that we agreed upon. Again, English is evolved as a language. It has, of course, roots in many Indo-European languages, and it has a lot of simplifications. It is a very derived language. I grew up speaking Greek, which is a much more ancient language, so basically the grammar is much more complex, there's much more rigidity, there's many fewer root, options. So for example, the word like hepatic liver is completely nonsensical. It's like two roots, one from Latin, one from Greek, that mean the same things, like the liver. Like, really? So the fact that English has all of these different roots to draw from, and all of these grammatical structures, and the pronunciation of English makes no sense if you only speak English. But if you speak 2 or 3 or 5 European languages, then pronunciation of English makes complete sense based on where each word came from. That's it. It's so simple. And sort of tracing that, pattern of thought, pattern of evolution of language itself, again, as an agreed upon communication medium, has a lot to do with how our brains work. We didn't arrive upon English because, it arrived on tablets from Moses. That's a different language. But we learned English because, that's how people started communicating. And eventually they would make the same mistakes. Things didn't quite sound right. They would flip some syllables. They would flip some sound. And then things would kind of roll off the tongue a little more easily, and so on and so forth. So that's an evolved language. But for DNA, that's a language that our brain is not very good at speaking. If you look at protein structure, that's a language that, again, our brain is terrible at speaking. If you look at chemical structures, if you look at gene functions, if you look at cellular transcriptional space. So that's what my day job is. My day job is trying to understand a language that none of us speaks. And to do this, we've basically developed a lot of this cognitive cartography, looking at this latent Z space, this latent vector representation of construct that make no sense initially. So in the same way that you can go from pixels in an image and build your way up towards more abstract concepts of shapes that you're scanning in the image, you can go in a genome and basically scan not just individual letters, but now words and patterns and motifs. And you can build from those grammars. You can go into chemical space and start understanding no longer a linear grammar, like language, a one-dimensional linear grammar, and of course, the attention edges between it, the different words. But now you can understand beyond this linear and 2D version that we have for images, you can start understanding graphs. And the representations that come from graphs build on every atom in the context of all of the other atoms. And that context is what gives the atoms meaning. In the same way that the context of the other pixels give the pixels meaning, and they become shapes. So you can now start understanding the building blocks of chemistry by understanding how every atom is influenced by every other atom in a graph neural network. Everybody with me here so far? And you can do the same thing with protein structure. You can basically now start building the backbone chain of a protein, and then the meaning of the function of the protein comes from the combination of amino acids that are sort of falling together, and that together we have the Y label. We know which chemicals, kill E. coli, and which chemicals fight cancer, and that's the Y label. But now being able to now trace that into which part of the representation of chemicals is responsible for that, which part of the protein representation is responsible for the function of a protein, and for different functions of the protein, and that's a much, much harder, much more interesting problem. And again, we've done that for patient records, we've done that for knowledge graphs, we've done that for scientific papers and single cell data, etc. And we've also, in the last few years, been doing that for the combination of each of these data types and human language. And that's where it gets a lot of fun. Because you can now start training a multilingual system that is able to understand patient records and English, protein structure and English, knowledge graphs and structure and English. So you can start conversing with that system. Everybody excited about this?
Yeah.
Good. So we have built such a system. We basically built a system that is using geometric deep learning to, let me try to get rid of some of those things. controls. There you go. So we're able to now start speaking to that system, which understands human disease. It understands protein structure. It understands protein function. It also speaks English. So we can start designing next generation drugs against specific proteins, against specific pathways, against specific entities. And what's really exciting here is that we can also use this technology to peek inside the machine, to look inside the brain of the machine at those representations. And that's what allows us to now start representing these proteins, representing these structures, representing these knowledge graphs. So before I sort of discuss how you can start with a chemical and with every atom understand how its neighbors are influencing it. And at the first layer of abstraction, you're only looking at your own representation and then the representation of your neighbors. But then at the next layer, your neighbor's representation is influenced by their neighbors. And therefore, you're learning a much more holistic view of a chemical. And at every iteration, you're improving, you're revising your own representations for every atom, and then all of the nearby representations get revised by you just as their neighbors. You can do the same thing with a knowledge graph, where every node is a gene, and it is connected to many other types of nodes. So we now have 20,000 nodes for genes, and we have another 17,000 nodes for diseases. And every disease node will be updated based on which genes it interacts with. And every gene will be updated based on which pathways it interacts with. And therefore, a lipid pathway will influence a bunch of genes, which will then influence Alzheimer's disease if they're connected that way. And Alzheimer's will become perhaps more of a lipid metabolism or transport disease. And I don't know, cardiovascular will become more of a, lipid storage, or you name it. So the beauty of all of that is that you're letting the knowledge graph speak for itself and influence each other and then learn much more complex, much more multimodal representations. Is everybody with me here? Awesome. So we can now take this very high dimensional latent space of what was learned and start projecting it down using dimensionality reduction techniques like TSNE and UMAP to basically map it into 2 dimensions and actually for us humans visualize it. And we can do that for the combined space, where here you have drugs and genes and diseases and effects and phenotypes and anatomy and so on and so forth. And you can see that the different data types have actually been pushed apart from each other because they are fundamentally different data types. And then we can go into one of those, for example, genes, and expand it more systematically. We can basically see how that gene representation tracks with whatever the genes are actually doing, which was learned completely from scratch based on that knowledge graph. Is everybody with me here? And we can go a step further and now start using this multimodal learning approach, combining language and structure and knowledge graphs. And we can basically build these joint representations across these different data modalities. For example, we can combine together gene expression patterns and phenotypes from the individuals that carry those cells, and then understand how asthma or Alzheimer's or genetic predispositions influence cells in their transcription. You can do the same thing by having now the dots be individuals, patients. And you can understand what are the axes of variation. In this particular case, we're looking at principal component analysis, which is much more interpretable. And these axes of variation turn out to be, on one side, pathology, and on the other side, cognition, in the case of Alzheimer's disease. And we can now start relating that with what are the genes that vary along those dimensions. And along the cognition dimension vary a bunch of genes expressed in excitatory nerves. But along the pathology dimension, instead you have microglia and oligodendrocytes. So you can kind of start uncoupling the drivers of this variation. And you can just go to town with this. You can basically now say, okay, let's take multimodal representations of anything. So let's start with one modality right now, and let's think of human language. And you can take, for example, every poem or every love letter, or every, I don't know, Declaration of Independence, and map them into a cognitive landscape, okay? And this is what my first slide was going to be about this cognitive cartography, being able to map the latent representation of proteins, genes, poems, documents, scientific papers, and so on and so forth. Then understanding that landscape, being able to map it the same way that we map physical objects. And if you give a paper to a student, that student, if sufficiently dedicated, will be able to understand that paper. But if you give that same paper to their professor, the professor will just read the abstract and immediately know what the paper is about. They immediately will know where that paper sits in the landscape of knowledge for that field. And that's what knowledge base, that's what cartography is all about. So any beginner can collect data and facts, but a true expert weaves them into the very fabric of knowledge base. That representation of knowledge is what sets apart the expert from the novice. And of course, this is a beautiful picture of Albert Einstein. That's totally not a quote by Albert Einstein. So do not let random quotes mislead you. But that's the power of maps. The power of maps is that we as humans have been using them in our heads for thousands of years. We are embodied creatures. Remember, the self in Yoshi's talk was in the world. We are embodied physical creatures. And we have developed a lot of intuition for physical spaces, for topology, for where the landscapes are. When we go skiing, how many of you have gone skiing? Good. How many of you have gone skiing and used the map? Good. So when you arrive there, you basically see that there's a representation, a simplification of the landscape. The landscape itself is extremely complex. You're not going to map every tree. That's a meaningless map. What you're going to do is map every path, every landmass, every road, every obstacle, every gondola, and so on and so forth. So that's what maps are about. That's what we want for cognitive landscapes. We don't want to just say, oh, here's all the points. We want to say, and here's how they're organized. Because maps simplify, maps abstract, maps summarize. And again, that's all about representation learning. This is all at the root of how humanity works, how cognition works, how AI works, how evolution works, how genomes work, and everything else. So, in that context, we can now go and map these cognitive landscapes. And we basically said, okay, let's start with one modality. Let's take every gene in the human genome, take its description as if it was some sonnet, and then map their descriptions in cognitive space. And guess what? You are rediscovering the organization of biology across 20,000 genes. It's remarkable. And then you end up with, centriole biogenesis, ubiquitin regulation, autophagy regulation, apoptosis regulation, and all these things are actually near each other, which makes a lot of sense in this cognitive space. You can also just, not do that in biology, you can do that in the New York Times. So we took 3 million articles from the New York Times, and we just mapped them in that same latent representation. And then we're able to navigate now 3 million articles. I don't know the last time that you saw 3 million articles on the same page, but it's not something that we typically do. But it actually makes complete sense, because the AI representation of knowledge is actually matching the human representation of knowledge. And notice that we can give names to those entities by summarizing the concepts using these latent embedded representations. We can also go to town with this. We can basically have a blast. At the top left here, I'm basically showing you every single paper that was written by an MIT author, along with every grant obtained by the same scientific lab. And while we're at it, the physical two-dimensional map of campus, where those papers were written. So you can actually start seeing the connections between the cognitive world and the physical world. In the middle here, I'm basically showing you how knowledge changes over time. Where you can basically see those same scientific papers, but I can scroll a bar that basically says which papers were written in which decade. On the top right over here, I'm basically showing you 100,000 loans with quantitative data about their FICO score and their grade, along with the cognitive projection of the corresponding description of those grants that allows me to now start saying which grants are fair or unfair given the context. At the bottom left, I'm basically showing you every class taught at MIT with their relationships and their prerequisites and how the knowledge flows across these different graphs. And on the bottom right, I'm basically showing you data from my own lab, from every meeting we've had, and who's reporting on what and how people are progressing over time. And as I mentioned earlier, these maps don't need to be language only. In this particular case, I'm showing you the joint embedding of protein, structure, and function. And these maps don't need to be just, cute little diagrams. We can actually go and click on those maps and go and learn about this latent landscape. So basically here we have a latent embedding representation across protein structure, function, and knowledge graphs for 20,000 human genes. But what's really cool is that I don't have to stop there. I don't have to just simply leave the map as printed. We're in the age of AI. So I can basically use an AI assistant to understand how the path of, say, these genes, relates to their function. So I can basically, create these bags, and from the bags, start asking, for example, I can name this, path 1, and then I can create a new bag, and select some more genes, and, now call this, FHF complex or something. And then I can, sort of create another bag, and, I can basically now ask, how is, FHF complex different from, path 1? And the AI assistant is basically receiving these documents as context. So this is basically retrieval augmented generation, or RAG, but on steroids, because it is visual. I'm able to directly ask the AI about the documents that I'm interacting with. So that's what I want you to sort of get away with. The fact that these latent spaces can actually be directly explored. You can use a lasso tool. You can basically use a hierarchy to go and understand how all of these relate to each other. And for example, these are all of the genes associated with protein phosphatase function. And I can search for, lipids, and I can find, all of the genes associated with lipids. But instead of just looking at a giant list, I can see how they fall in the context, in the landscape, in the cartography. And I can sort of organize them this way. So we've built this for, almost anything. So, let's see. So for example, who has heard of Lex Friedman here? Lex Friedman? Yeah, awesome, huge fan. So Lex has had a ton of conversations, including with Joshua, including with me, and we can now go and, search for Joshua. Bat, for example. That's easier to spell. And you can basically find all of the conversations that Joshua has had with Lex, and we can see sort of where they fall, and you can sort of organize them based on, their, I don't know if you recognize that, how to deal with loneliness. Yes. and you can kind of click on that and basically go and, find a corresponding space, and you can kind of zoom in. And you can see here that at the center of Lex's podcast lies the meaning of life. And that meaning of life, when you zoom in, you can kind of learn more about existentialism, about the simulation debate, and free will and virtual reality, and exploring life and mortality, and so on and so forth. Who wants to use this? Raise your hands. Yes, awesome. Who wants to map some crazy space to this? Raise your hands. Awesome. Yeah, I do too. So this is called Mantis. It's a little tool that we built with mostly high school students and freshmen and sophomores here at MIT. And we're looking to apply to almost anything to map cognitive landscapes, to understand human thought, to understand how we represent knowledge. And we basically created this panoply of tools, including this narrator that I mentioned earlier, but also agents that you can deploy and sort of carry out computation, an orchestrator that receives the results from those agents and it computes. This compute Jupyter sandbox, so that when you ask for something more complicated, it generates the code on the fly that then goes running. You can go and edit the code. You can go back and forth. You can export the clusters and the tree and the names. You can create variables on the fly. You can analyze basically any kind of data with it. So embrace embedding spaces, embrace cartography. Our ancestors have been using it for a while, so the way that Leonidas was able to fight off the army of Xerxes and save the Western world back in, like 2,000 years ago, was by understanding the map, understanding where in the landscape to intervene. And these cognitive maps are basically made for the things that we have evolved for hierarchy, abstraction, collaboration. Oh, I forgot to mention that we also have this collaboration button that allows you to now see how multiple people are browsing the map at the same time. Just like you can share your location with your friends when you're exploring the landscape, you can do the same thing here. And what's really fascinating is that the relationship of documents to each other in our brain and in the LLM actually matches. The pairwise distances are actually very similar. If you start looking at brain activation maps and LLM activation maps, they're actually very, very similar to each other. So it really allows you to peek inside the brain of the machine. And I'm going to leave you with this cartoon here with Dilbert, who basically says, Zimbu the monkey has designed 3 commercial products this week. We better find out his secret. He's using his tail. He has a natural advantage. I feel the jaws of evolution on my throat. Good grief, did you see him cut and paste? And then the monkey explains, your big mistake, evolution-wise, was inventing computers that are easier to use if you have a tail. In an ironic twist in the Darwinian saga, you guarantee the extinction of your own species. And Dilbert is, of course, saying, stop working while I'm talking to you. I can hear the evolutionary clock, tick-tock, tick-tock, tick-tock. So what's happening here is that we, as humans, have created data landscapes that are unsuited for us. We basically relegated the integration of millions of documents to ChatGPT and to search engines and to whatever, Facebook's algorithm will basically give to us next, or YouTube Shorts, or you name it, or TikTok. And we are passively consuming whatever the AI decides for us. What I'm hoping this type of technology allows us to do is bring the humans back in the loop and not fear spaces with millions of entries, with millions of documents. And we've used these to map people, to map patients, to map contacts, to map events, to map books, to map chapters, to map documents, to map your hard drive, to map your email, to map your LinkedIn, to map almost anything. And we're looking for partners. We're just building this, from nothing. So if you guys want to collaborate, reach out. My name is Manolis, Kellis, and you can find me right with cannoli, so you'll never forget cannoli, only Greek. And again, AI has a natural advantage in unmapped spaces, but with the proper tools, humans have always prevailed. So here's one for humanity.
Time for one really deep question.
Let's take 2 shallow questions. You guys, whoever wrote their hand first. I saw your hand way earlier. So.
Yeah, so super interesting talk, thank you. When you represent something in feature space, if that data in the feature space is as much as the data, then you're missing the point, right?
Of course.
So how do you minimize that feature space to be truly representative?
Yeah, so these are living in very high dimensional spaces. So basically, papers live in 1,500 dimensions. We compress them to 2-dimensional for humans to see them in a function that preserves the distances of all the nearby points. And therefore, we're actually preserving the super high dimensionality in the distance functions of pairs of points to each other. And that's what leads to these meaningful landscapes. Next one.
Great. Do you think social media algorithms are building their own representations and giving reward systems?
Absolutely. That's how they're serving us stuff. They're basically saying, I'm going to serve you something from here. The only thing we're doing is we're making it explicit, and we're giving you a data science workbench to work with it.
And then do you think you could use this to model or then view that reward system?
I would like to be able to, when I browse my social media, say, just show me all the, like I want to see my browser history in latent space. Mm-hmm. I want to see, where I've been. I'm like, just get rid of that cluster. I like this one and that one, and sort of show me ads for that one.
Wait, your browser history?
Everything.
Oh no.
Oh, you should learn about incognito mode, my friend.
How we accounting for non-deterministic effects?
Like, my mom always told me, don't worry about 2 types of decisions. The decisions that are easy to make, because something is very different, you just make them easily. The decisions that are hard to make is because those 2 choices are kind of similar to each other. Don't worry about those either. So basically, when you have non-determinism, it's usually between places where, I don't know, turning right and turning left over here on the ski slope is probably the same. So I would argue that the differences in representation that I have and you have are probably non-consequential. They're probably different, but not consequential. And therefore, at the limits, because the human is back in the loop, you don't have to worry about those. Yes?
Can you elaborate more on the parallels between the brain activation maps and the LLM activation maps?
So the way that I learned English is probably the same way that you learned English, by reading a bunch of stuff that made no sense at first. And then eventually I started seeing how the word, I don't know, the typical example is president and king and dictator and, you know, something, are all, and leader, for example, they're all living in the same space. Why? Because in next word prediction, the context that allowed me to predict the word president was actually quite similar to the context that allowed me to predict the word king. And therefore, president and king got a similar coordinate in this latent 1,500 dimensional space. And that's how we probably learn language, and that's how the machines definitely learn language. With this next word prediction or hidden token prediction that basically allows you to learn latent vectors for every word. You now combine these words together with attention models that basically allow you to now transform the original space into a revised space where the word apple is no longer in a fruit basket, but it's instead in a hardware store. And by understanding that hardware store, I'm probably using the wrong word, like Apple Store. The Apple Store basically moves the word apple from a representation of a fruit basket to a representation of a computer. And, okay.
By the way, actually, if anybody wants to hear more of his incredibly insane and genius ideas, I mean that in a good way, by the way, he's going to be on Kurt Mongo's Theories of Everything podcast very shortly. We're actually filming that on, what, Tuesday? Yeah, in like a couple days. And that should go up in like a week or two. So you'll get more in-depth, more detail. You're going to feel like you're inside of his mind. Tune in for that and we'll share it online. Give it up for Manolis, Kellis.
While we're setting up the next talk, a short suggestion. I would like to see an inverse Turing test at some point. Imagine you have a jury of LLMs that try to figure out whether what they're talking to is an LLM or just a human impersonator. It's something that fits nicely in the scope of a small hackathon. And it would be really interesting to see if we could basically plug in a jury of the current LLMs, prompt them in different ways, then have different candidates which are humans or LLMs and see what happens.
Let's do it.